Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. When the jungle goes silent, you feel it in your teeth. Not quiet, not the normal lull between bird calls. Silent, as if every living thing has decided at the exact same moment to stop making noise so it can listen for you. No cicadas, no distant monkeys, no wind whirring the elephant grass. Just your own breath inside a steel box and the low diesel growl of 6 M113A CAVs chewing up Highway 13 at a stubborn 15 miles an hour. You're 24, you're the platoon leader. 37 men have placed their lives in your hands, and if you're honest, you still don't feel old enough to rent a car back home without someone asking where your father is. The map calls this stretch a supply route. The men have a better name for it, Thunder Road, because every mile sounds like trouble coming. And the enemy has been watching you for months, learning what time your tracks roll, how long you halt to check culverts, where your gunners get lazy, which vehicle carries the platoon leader, which one carries the medic, which one always rides trail. They've waited for the one morning when the humidity sits like a wet rag on the world and the sky is the color of dented tin, when the road narrows and the jungle presses close enough to feel like a mouth. You have 3 seconds to decide what to do. Turn back and risk a court-martial for refusing an order. Keep moving forward into a place your instincts label trap in capital letters. Or stop, and become a stationary target. A picture-perfect silhouette for every RPG team hidden in the trees. First Lieutenant Michael Doc Holloway, Amarillo, Texas, felt sweat slide down his spine despite the early morning chill. 4 months in Vietnam with Blackhorse, 23 patrols, not a single real firefight worth writing home about. His men called him Doc because before officer candidate school he'd been pre-med, because he hoarded bandages and plasma expanders like they were gold, because he'd once held Private Jenkins together after a landmine hit until the dust-off finally chopped its way down through the canopy. A small photo of his wife Sarah was taped to the dash of his command track with a strip of grimy green tape. She was smiling in it, head tilted slightly, like she'd just heard a joke that only she understood. Before he boarded the plane, she'd made him promise something simple. Don't be a hero, just come home. He'd promised. And then, 3 seconds ago, the jungle stopped breathing. He didn't understand what that meant until the moment came that turned Thunder Road into a slaughterhouse. Michael Holloway hadn't planned on the army. He'd planned on anatomy labs, on late-night study sessions that smelled like coffee and formaldehyde, on following his father into general practice back in Amarillo. The sort of life where the hardest decisions involve sleep and student loans. But medical school cost money his family didn't have, and the draft board didn't care about dreams. His deferment ended. 3 weeks later, the notice arrived like a slap. He could have run to Canada. 3 guys he knew did. He never judged them. He just couldn't picture himself living with it. So he enlisted instead, took the OCS route, and told himself he'd serve as some kind of medical officer. Patch wounds, save lives, do his time, come home. The army looked at his test scores, his physics degree, and the way he didn't panic when a cadre instructor screamed an inch from his face, and they decided they had other uses for him. They made him cavalry. 6 months later, he was half a world away, riding in a tracked vehicle that reeked of diesel and gun oil, responsible for men whose last names he'd barely memorized before they started calling him Doc, like it was both a joke and a prayer. His father had served in Korea and never talked about it. Michael understood now why some experiences refuse translation. You can't describe the weight of being the person who says go or stop when both options might get someone killed. You can't explain the tiredness that goes deeper than muscles, the kind that settles behind your eyes and makes everything feel distant. At first he wrote Sarah every day, then every other day, then twice a week, not because he loved her less, because he could feel himself turning into a man she wouldn't recognize, and he didn't know how to confess that in neat handwriting on thin paper. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, Blackhorse, had a reputation that followed it like exhaust smoke. Fast, aggressive, unforgiving. They'd been in country since 1966, operating where Cambodia's border turned every map line into a sanctuary for the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese regulars. Enemy units could strike, vanish, and dare the Americans to chase them into political quicksand. Blackhorse's job was simple on paper: find them, fix them, finish them. It was a job designed by men who'd never had an RPG pointed at their chest from 10 yards away. Highway 13 ran north from Saigon through Bien Long Province, a critical artery for convoys and fire bases. The Americans needed it open to feed ammunition and fuel into the countryside. The Viet Cong needed it closed to prove the Americans couldn't control anything beyond the radius of their own bases. Men died over asphalt and dirt. That was what war turned into when you stripped away speeches. Holloway's platoon drew the patrol nobody wanted. A show of force run along a stretch where intelligence claimed increased enemy activity. Roll armor through. Make it obvious. Make it loud. Make the enemy think twice. It was the kind of plan that looked clean in a briefing tent and felt like volunteering to walk into a set of crossed rifles once you were actually on the road. He didn't tell his men the details of the intel. He didn't mention the ARVN patrols that had disappeared in the last month like stones dropped into deep water. What would it help? Fear didn't make anyone shoot straighter. Better they trusted him. Better they believed Doc knew what he was doing, even if Doc sometimes felt like he was building the plane while falling out of the sky. Stories like Holloway's don't survive because they're typed into neat after-action reports. They survive because the men who lived through them keep repeating the names and the moments, refusing to let the truth shrink into a footnote. Somewhere in that jungle, a man named Van Thon had been planning for Holloway long before Holloway ever heard the word Thunder Road. Thon was 37, old enough to have watched different flags come and go. He had fought the French. He had fought South Vietnamese forces. Now he fought Americans. Young men wrapped in flak vests and confidence, bringing radios and artillery and the kind of steel that chewed roads into dust. Thon stayed alive not because he was lucky, but because he learned. He studied American armor like a doctor studies a disease. He collected patterns. He listened. He watched how cavalry moved when it was bored, how it moved when it smelled trouble, how it hesitated at bends in the road. He'd seen ambushes succeed and fail, and he understood the part that mattered most. If you didn't destroy American armor in the first minute, you'd be fighting American firepower after it recovered from surprise. And after surprise faded, Americans turned radio calls into explosions. They turned fear into momentum. Thon respected the Americans, even while wanting them out of his country. He'd watched them pull wounded men out under fire. He'd watched them level jungle with artillery. He'd watched them refuse to quit even when quitting would have been sensible. That made them dangerous. His plan for Highway 13 took weeks. He chose a 3-kilometer stretch where the road curved slightly and the vegetation pressed in thick enough that tracks couldn't easily push through it. Dense jungle on both sides, the kind that swallowed movement and hid men 10 yards away. He placed mines where a reversing vehicle would die. He positioned heavy machine guns to seal the north and south ends of the kill zone, so the column couldn't escape forward or backward. He assigned 12 RPG teams, each with multiple rockets and clear lanes of fire angled toward the thinner side armor. At night, his men rehearsed. They memorized fields of fire. They practiced disappearing into the green. They prepared for helicopters, for artillery, for reinforcements. They prepared for everything except the one thing no plan can fully calculate. What happens when the men you ambush decide they have already lost the right to hope, and the only way to live is to kill everyone in front of them? For the Americans, losing Highway 13 meant convoys rerouted through worse terrain, supply lines stretched thin, doubts creeping into every meeting in Saigon. For Thon, shutting Highway 13 meant proving the Americans couldn't protect what they claimed to control. For Holloway, it meant something simpler and heavier. Bring his men through. Don't be the lieutenant who gets them all killed because he chose wrong in the wrong 3 seconds. The world beyond the jungle was watching. My Hanoi, commanders with clean maps and pressed uniforms. But on Highway 13, none of that mattered as much as the hard truth of a platoon trapped between trees and explosives. And then the jungle, holding its breath, exhaled violence. The first RPG hit 3 seconds after the silence ended. Not the lead track, not the trail. Holloway's command track, third in the column, exactly where doctrine said the platoon leader should ride. The warhead struck at a perfect angle, a shaped charge designed to turn armor into a furnace. The impact didn't sound like a movie explosion. It sounded like the world being punched. Holloway felt it before he heard it, pressure slamming him sideways into his radio telephone operator. Heat rolled through the compartment. Not flame yet, but the kind of heat that tells you flame is on its way. The smell hit next, burning metal, diesel vapor, and something sickeningly organic that made the throat want to close. For a heartbeat, there was no sound again, just the ringing inside his skull. Then everything arrived at once. Automatic weapons, RPGs launching with that unmistakable thump crack, mines detonating with deep, tearing booms. Track's engines still roaring even as daylight suddenly appeared through gaps that weren't supposed to exist in the armor. Someone was screaming. It might have been the radio. It might have been Jenkins. It might have been Holloway. His hands came up wet. Blood, not his. Private Jenkins, 20, baby-faced under grime, had been hit. Chest, bad. Doc's extra medical supplies were stowed behind them. The back of the vehicle was beginning to burn. Training said assess, report, react. Reality said do all 3 at the same time or die. Through smoke and vibration, Holloway saw the lead track dead in the road, engine compartment punched open, crew spilling out into machine gun fire. He saw the trail vehicle trying to reverse, tracks grinding, and knew instantly it was wrong, because Thon had planned for that. A mine blossomed under the rear of the last vehicle and lifted it like a toy, dropping it sideways across the highway. Men inside, burning. No time to think about men inside. Think later. Act now or die now. The ambush was perfect in the way only rehearsed violence can be perfect. Machine guns raked the road. RPG teams reloaded with calm speed. The kill zone tightened like a fist. The Americans had maybe 60 seconds before the entire column became a line of burning wrecks. Thon had seen Americans freeze before. He'd seen panic. He'd seen men dismount and try to fight on foot in a kill zone, an almost guaranteed way to die. He had planned to watch them break. What he hadn't fully prepared for was a young lieutenant who, in the first shock of fire and blood, would choose the one option that sounded insane and was still the only one that might work. Holloway's radio erupted. Voices stacked on voices. Second platoon, requesting permission to turn back. Third track, pinned, can't move, taking fire. Someone screaming for medevac coordinates. Everyone asking the same question, different ways. Doc, what do we do? The photo of Sarah had come loose. It floated down into pooled diesel at his boots, her smile now shining through a sheen of fuel like she was trapped underwater. Jenkins was making a sound that didn't seem human. Fire crawled along the compartment wall toward the fuel tanks. And Holloway understood, with a clarity so sharp it felt cold, that there was only one choice that didn't end with a road full of bodies and a few medals awarded to men who couldn't wear them. He keyed the radio. His voice came out steady, not calm, but controlled, like a man gripping the edge of a cliff. "All tracks, listen, do not stop, do not reverse. Full throttle forward through the kill zone. Stay in column. Return fire with everything. Forward, through, now." For a moment there was disbelief, then acknowledgments one by one. Because Doc had brought them through 23 patrols. Because they trusted him. Because the jungle behind them and the mines behind them had turned retreat into a slower way to die. Holloway's track lurched forward, wounded but moving. The driver, Specialist Robert Morrison, 19 from Philadelphia, had his foot buried on the accelerator like he could push them through the war by force of will. Smoke poured from the damaged engine compartment. Flames licked somewhere forward, out of sight, hungry. The .50 caliber up top hammered, not with careful aim but with fury. Sergeant James Davis, Detroit, traversing across the tree line, shredding brush and branches and anything unlucky enough to be behind them. The column began to move, not creeping, charging. Tracks clattered, engines screamed, and every vehicle fired every weapon it had. At 15 miles an hour, it became 20. Dirt and dust blasted up. Smoke made the highway look like a storm cloud. RPGs streaked in, but now targets were moving too fast, sliding through their lanes of fire, vanishing behind their own dust. Jenkins was still conscious. Holloway pressed his palm hard against the chest wound, feeling blood pulse between his fingers with every beat of Jenkins's heart. The proper procedure, stop, render aid, call dust off, was written for a world where you weren't inside a trap. The proper procedure right now meant dying in place. So Holloway did something that violated the neat rules he'd been taught. He bellowed into the compartment. "Ramirez, take Jenkins, keep him breathing." Corporal Miguel Ramirez, El Paso, slid forward, hands already moving with that frantic precision medics develop when there's no time for fear. He grabbed Jenkins and began the desperate work of keeping a man alive in a bouncing steel box. Holloway leaned toward the driver, voice close to Morrison's ear. "Don't stop for anything, anything." Then up to Davis. "Switch to the M60 when you need it. Close range. Crew serve weapons in the trees, find them." Davis didn't answer. He just kept firing, jaw clenched, eyes locked on the green wall that was trying to kill them. This wasn't suppressive fire anymore. It was murder fire, the kind that turns vegetation into confetti and makes hiding feel like standing behind paper. Thon watched his work unravel. His RPG teams were trained. His machine gunners were disciplined. His mines had hit where they were supposed to hit. The Americans should have become a row of burning coffins. Instead, the burning coffins kept driving. The Americans weren't reacting the way the lesson said they would. They weren't stopping to collect casualties. They weren't dismounting into the kill zone. They were doing the one thing that turned an ambush into a brawl. They were accepting losses and pushing forward anyway, turning their momentum into a weapon. Men began to die in Thon's positions, not because they'd made mistakes, but because the enemy refused to behave. And there is nothing more dangerous than an opponent who stops caring about survival as the first priority. Holloway felt the promise he'd made to Sarah cracking like old tape. Bring everyone home. But a promise like that was impossible from the start. You make it because love demands something to hold on to when the plane door closes. Jenkins' breathing turned wet, a rattle. Ramirez's hands were slick with blood. Behind them, someone shouted that another track had taken shrapnel. Somewhere a man was unconscious, thrown hard by the mine blast. The platoon was paying for every yard. Then suddenly the southern end of the kill zone broke open like a curtain pulled aside. The jungle thinned. And beyond the highway's edge was something Thon hadn't wanted to give them. Open ground. A wide rice paddy, 500 meters of flat, muddy expanse between road and tree line. Open ground meant maneuver. Open ground meant armor could do what it was built to do. Holloway saw it like a lifeline. He keyed the radio again. This time his voice sounded different, quieter, almost calm. The voice of a man who had stopped bargaining with fate. "All tracks, online formation, sweep the tree line. Anyone who shot at us is still there. Find them." The transformation from column to line took less than a minute. 6 armored vehicles fanned out across the paddy, spacing themselves like a comb dragging through mud, weapons aimed at the jungle edge. This was what the Viet Cong feared. This was why the ambush had needed to annihilate them quickly, because once American armor survived the first shock, radios and firepower turned hunters into hunted. Thon understood instantly. His men could fight infantry in the trees. They could bleed armor from concealment, but they could not stand in one place while .50 caliber rounds and machine gun fire walked across their positions, while artillery adjusted in, while helicopters came growling down from the sky like metal insects. He could already hear them. Faint at first, then louder. The rotors. Gunships, medevacs, reinforcements. The window for clean withdrawal was shrinking. The Americans had a saying Thon had read in captured papers: "If you're going through hell, keep going." He hadn't grasped it until now, until he watched tracks that were burning refuse to stop, until he watched wounded men keep firing, until he watched a lieutenant who should have been calling dust off and begging for relief, instead call for fire support and drive his platoon like a spear into the place that was trying to bury them. Artillery arrived first. A fire support base north of the highway had been monitoring the frantic radio traffic, and once Holloway broke out, they began to work with professional speed. The first rounds landed beyond the tree line, then walked back in measured steps. The jungle bucked under explosions. Earth and leaves and smoke flew skyward. Thon's men started to peel away, dragging wounded, leaving behind carefully built positions that had cost them weeks. Some of them moved like ghosts, disciplined even in retreat. Some of them ran, because courage has limits when the sky itself is falling. Morrison's track was still moving. The engine fire somehow had died, starved when a ruptured fuel line bled out. Morrison's forearms were burned, angry red and blistering, but he kept both hands on the controls like they were the only thing holding his world together. Ramirez kept pressure on Jenkins's wound all the way through the charge. Jaw tight, eyes bright with that furious concentration that comes from refusing to accept death as inevitable. Holloway realized as artillery continued to hammer the trees that the fight hadn't been decided by technology alone. Not by armor, not by weapons, not even by training. It had been decided by refusal, by 37 men who trusted each other more than they trusted doctrine. By a driver who kept his foot down while fire licked toward him, by a gunner who stayed exposed behind a heavy weapon instead of diving for cover, by a corporal with blood up to his elbows trying to keep a stranger alive. War, stripped of slogans, is often just professionals doing violent work with skill and paying for it in ways that can't be totaled neatly. Private First Class David Jenkins died in the medevac helicopter 17 minutes after liftoff. He was 20. He'd been in country 3 months. He joined, people later said, because his father had served in World War II and never spoke about it, and Jenkins wanted to understand the silence that lived behind his father's eyes. Now his father would understand why some things don't translate. Holloway had held pressure on Jenkins's chest for 8 minutes, promising him he'd make it, because lieutenants promise things when they don't know what else to do with the helplessness. Another promise broken. Jenkins's last words weren't about himself, they were about Morrison, asking if Morrison got out okay. Morrison did. Second-degree burns, but alive. Davis survived, Ramirez survived. 29 men from Holloway's platoon made it through. 8 did not. 8 names Holloway would carry like stones in his pockets for the rest of his life. 8 families who would receive telegrams, folded flags, and sentences that sounded noble and felt empty. Viet Cong losses were harder to count. Thon's own report, captured years later, listed numbers that American estimates argued with. Body counts were always slippery. Everyone had reasons to inflate or minimize. What mattered was this. Thon's unit abandoned its prepared positions and lost operational strength for weeks. Highway 13 stayed open. The Americans kept moving. The battlefield afterward looked like war when no one is taking photos for headlines. Burned vehicles, shredded jungle, shell craters filling with muddy water, blood soaking into ground that would grow rice again because farming outlasts fighting. The jungle would absorb it. The question was whether the men would. 3 hours after the ambush, Holloway stood beside Morrison's scarred track while recovery vehicles clanked in and helicopters thudded away. The air smelled of scorched metal and churned earth. That other smell, flesh, jungle sap, diesel, hung in the back of the throat. He found the photograph of Sarah and lifted it carefully. The paper was damp, stained, edges singed. Her smile still showed through. She looked like someone from another life. A woman who had no idea that her husband had been forced to decide in 3 seconds which promises he could keep and which ones would cost blood. Holloway had not been wounded. No Purple Heart, no bandaged arm, no visible scar that people could point to and understand. But the weight was there anyway. The weight was knowing Jenkins died because Holloway ordered the platoon to keep moving. The weight was knowing that choice was tactically right and personally brutal. The weight was knowing Morrison burned because Holloway told him not to stop. The weight was knowing Ramirez would dream of arterial blood for decades. Costs like that don't arrive all at once. They come due in installments, at night, in sudden sounds, in the way a smell can pull you backwards through time. Sergeant Davis approached quietly. He looked older than 23 in that moment, eyes fixed on things no one else could see. "Sir," he said, voice rough, "the guys wanted me to tell you, you made the right call. If we'd stopped, we'd all be dead." He hesitated. Jenkins knew that. He told Ramirez you'd get us through. Holloway wanted to believe it, wanted to accept that command meant making those calculations and living with them. But Jenkins' last words echoed anyway, worrying about someone else while dying. That's what they were, Holloway realized. Not a platoon, not a unit, friends who would die thinking about each other. Holloway rotated home 3 months later on schedule. He had the badges, the medals, a bronze star that sat in a box, an air medal tied to that day's helicopter ride, paper proof that he had done his duty. But the weight didn't disappear. It just became familiar, like a limp you learned to hide. Sarah learned the signs, the distant look, the way he'd wake sweating when thunder rolled. She learned not to ask certain questions. She learned that some answers don't heal. Holloway lived with Highway 13 for decades before he ever told the full story out loud. Not to Sarah, not completely, not to therapists, because describing combat to someone who hasn't lived it can feel like explaining color to someone born blind. He finally told it to Morrison at a Blackhorse reunion in 2009, in a hotel ballroom in Colorado Springs where old men gathered with young ghosts behind their eyes. Morrison still wore long sleeves even in summer. The burn scars ran like pale maps along his forearms. He'd become a machinist after discharge, built a life that made sense because machines at least obeyed rules. He'd married a woman who understood that sometimes he needed space, that loud noises weren't just loud. That night he said something that shifted the way Holloway carried the memory. "I knew we were probably going to die when you gave the order," Morrison admitted, looking down at his own hands. "But stopping meant dying for sure. You gave us a chance, Doc. That's all anyone could do. Give us a chance." Davis's road had been rougher. PTSD before the military knew what to call it. Drinking. A marriage that collapsed under the strain. A gun in his mouth once, finger on the trigger, stopped by the memory of Holloway's voice on the radio and the sound of men calling each other's names. He got help. He spent years working with veterans, telling them the thing nobody told him in 1970. You aren't weak, you're injured. Injuries can heal if you let them. Ramirez became a physician assistant, then specialized in trauma. He spent decades trying to save strangers the way he couldn't quite save Jenkins. He wrote Jenkins' mother every year on the anniversary, not with patriotic phrases, but with the truth, that her son's last act was worrying about a friend. The 8 who didn't make it never got reunions, never got marriages or children or the slow process of turning horror into memory and memory into something you can live beside. They got headstones, they got folded flags, they got remembered by the men who survived and by families who still felt the shape of the whole decades later. Thon survived too, according to records that surfaced after the war. Many of his men survived. They had fought with skill and courage for what they believed was right, just as Holloway's men had. War doesn't distribute bravery by uniform color. It distributes grief to everyone within reach. The fault, when there was fault, sat higher than Highway 13. It lived in strategy rooms in Washington and Hanoi, in decisions made by people who would never smell burning diesel, never feel the concussion of an RPG, never press a hand against a chest wound and choose motion over mercy. Soldiers do their part. The question that haunted Holloway wasn't whether he'd been brave. He didn't care about that. The question was whether the objective had ever been worth the cost. Highway 13 is just road now. Asphalt patched and repatched, dirt shoulders shifting with seasons. The jungle has grown back into places where it was shredded. Rice still grows in paddies that once held men's last breaths. But the weight of that morning never fully left the men who lived it. Holloway kept Sarah's photograph, still stained, still singed, in his wallet until the day he died. He never cleaned it, never replaced it. When Sarah once asked why, gently, he said something that sounded simple and carried the whole war inside it. Because it reminds me that some promises can't be kept perfectly, but you keep them anyway. You promise to bring everyone home. 8 don't make it. You promise to come home unchanged. You come home carrying ghosts. You promise, you break promises, you live with what you did. Because the alternative is giving up, and the men you served with deserved better than watching you give up. And if you ever wonder what the jungle's silence means, it means someone, somewhere, has decided it's time for the world to hold its breath before violence. On Highway 13, 3 seconds was all it took to learn that courage and firepower are worthless without the will to use them, and that the cost of using them doesn't end when the shooting stops.